Late one night, a humble man's desperate plea for justice collides with systemic prejudice, sparking a revelation that stuns everyone involved. Who is this man's daughter, and how will her identity turn the tables in an unforgettable way? Before we dive into this eye-opening story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth behind society's hidden injustices. Do you know how long I've been waiting here? Walter Parker's voice, though soft, carried the weight of his frustration. His fingers clutched his cane tightly, his dark brown eyes scanning the nearly empty police station. Behind the counter, Officer Adam Scott barely looked up from his paperwork. "You've been helped already, sir," Scott said flatly, his pen scratching against the clipboard. "We don't have any new information for you." Walter sighed, shifting his weight from one leg to the other. He wasn't a man accustomed to raising his voice, but the dismissiveness in the officer's tone dug deep under his skin. "I told you there's a suspicious car parked by my house. It's been there for hours, lights off, engine running. It doesn't feel right." Scott finally looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he studied the older man. Walter was dressed neatly in slacks and a button-down shirt, his shoes polished despite the wear and tear of years. Still, his presence seemed to trigger a quiet skepticism in Scott. "And you're sure it's not just a neighbor's car?" Scott asked, his tone laced with indifference. Walter shook his head. "I've lived in that neighborhood for over 40 years. I know every car on that street. This one isn't familiar." Scott leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "We'll send someone out when we can, but right now we're stretched thin, Mr. Parker." Walter's jaw tightened. "You're not stretched too thin to keep questioning me, though, are you?" Scott's expression darkened, and he leaned forward. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've seen this play out before," Walter said evenly. "You don't take someone like me seriously until it's too late." The air in the room grew tense. Scott's jaw twitched as he weighed his response, but before he could speak, another officer walked by, giving Scott a look that seemed to say, "Be careful." Scott ignored it, focusing entirely on Walter. "I don't appreciate the implication," Scott said, his voice cold. "We're here to help everyone equally." Walter let out a dry laugh. "If that were true, I wouldn't be standing here repeating myself. You'd already have someone checking that car." "You need to calm down, sir," Scott said sharply. "We're doing the best we can." Walter didn't flinch. He stood firm despite the slight tremor in his hands. "I taught kids like you," he said, his tone quiet but pointed. "Bright, ambitious kids who thought they had all the answers. But I'll tell you what I told them. Your badge doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible." Scott bristled, his face flushing with a mix of irritation and embarrassment. "Sir, if you don't stop this behavior, I'll have to ask you to leave." Walter raised his hands, palms out. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I don't feel safe, and I thought this was the place to turn to. Maybe I was wrong." Scott stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Let me see some ID." Walter blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "ID?" Scott repeated. "If you're so familiar with your neighborhood, then you shouldn't have any problem proving you live there." Walter stared at him, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. Scott studied it, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Walter Parker," Scott read aloud, his tone almost mocking. 82 years old, retired, lives on Cedar Avenue." Walter crossed his arms. "Does all of that check out? Or do you need to call someone to confirm?" Scott's lips pressed into a thin line. "Wait here." Walter watched as Scott walked into a back room, his ID in hand. He felt the stares of other officers, though none of them intervened. The weight of their silence was suffocating. A younger officer, one who had just walked in, hesitated before approaching Walter. "Sir, do you need a seat? There's a bench just over there." Walter shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you." The younger officer nodded and walked away, clearly uneasy with the tension in the room. Walter remained standing, his cane steady beneath his grip. Minutes passed before Scott returned. "Everything checks out," he said flatly, handing the ID back to Walter. "But I'm going to need you to move along now. We'll check on the car when we can." Walter took his ID and slipped it back into his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I expected more from you." Scott frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I expected you to see me as a human being first, not as a problem," Walter replied. He turned to leave but stopped just before reaching the door. "Do me a favor, Officer Scott. When you finally send someone out to check that car and you realize I wasn't wasting your time, I want you to think about why it took so much for me to be heard." With that, he walked out, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. Scott stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the station. Walter paused at the curb, staring at the quiet streets. His heart was heavy, not just with the events of the evening, but with the years of small indignities that had accumulated like stones in his pockets. As he turned to head home, a car pulled up beside him. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a young woman with sharp eyes and a confident demeanor. "Dad," she said, her voice both surprised and concerned. "What are you doing out here this late?" Walter's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sight of his daughter, Alicia. She was dressed in a sleek navy suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. A briefcase sat in the passenger seat. "I was just trying to do the right thing," Walter said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Alicia frowned. "What happened?" Walter hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "Dad," Alicia pressed, her tone firm, "I know you didn't come all the way to the station for nothing. Tell me." Walter sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "There's a car parked outside my house. It doesn't belong there. I went to the station to report it, but they didn't listen," Alicia finished, her expression hardening. Walter nodded. "Something like that." Alicia leaned back in her seat, her mind already racing. She glanced at her watch, then back at her father. "Get in. We'll handle this together." Walter hesitated for a moment before opening the car door and sliding into the passenger seat. As they drove off, his mind churned with a mix of relief and apprehension. Whatever happened next, he knew Alicia wouldn't let it go. And neither would he. The car ride was tense. The silence between Walter and his daughter, Alicia, a mix of unspoken words and simmering emotions. Alicia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her polished nails reflecting the faint streetlights as they passed. She glanced sideways at her father, who stared out of the window, lost in thought. "You shouldn't have to deal with this, Dad," Alicia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but there was an undertone of pain. "They should have listened to you the first time." Walter sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the night pressed down on him. "It's not the first time I've been ignored, Alicia, and it probably won't be the last." "That doesn't make it right," Alicia replied, her tone sharp. "You've lived in that neighborhood longer than some of these officers have been alive. You deserve better than this." Walter turned to her, his expression softening despite the weariness in his eyes. "It's not about what I deserve, sweetheart. It's about what's real. This is the world we live in." Alicia clenched her jaw, her thoughts racing. She had spent years fighting battles in courtrooms, dismantling systemic injustices one case at a time, but this was personal. This was her father. As they approached Walter's house, Alicia slowed the car, her sharp gaze scanning the street. Sure enough, a dark sedan sat parked under a broken streetlight, its windows tinted. The engine was off, but the faint glow of a phone screen was visible inside. "That against the wall?" Eventually, Walter murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia parked a few houses away, pulling out her phone to snap a few pictures of the car. "Stay here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Walter frowned. "Alicia, Stay, she repeated firmly. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement, and walked toward the sedan with purpose. The person inside must have noticed her approaching as the phone screen disappeared and the driver's silhouette shifted. Alicia stopped a few feet away, her hands on her hips. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady and authoritative. "Can I help you with something?" The driver rolled down the window just enough to be heard. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said defensively. His tone was casual, but Alicia caught the edge in his voice. "This is a residential neighborhood," Alicia replied, her gaze unwavering. "People here value their safety and privacy. If you're not up to anything suspicious, you won't mind telling me why you've been parked here for hours?" The driver hesitated, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. "I'm waiting for someone." "Really?" Alicia asked, raising an eyebrow. "Who?" The man didn't respond immediately, and Alicia could feel the tension rising. Before she could press further, the sound of an engine broke the quiet. A police cruiser turned the corner, its headlights washing over the scene. Walter stepped out of Alicia's car as the cruiser approached. "Alicia, let them handle it," he called out, his voice tinged with concern. The police car came to a stop, and Officer Scott stepped out, his expression a mix of irritation and apprehension. He hadn't expected to see Walter again, let alone accompanied by someone who exuded authority. "What's going on here?" Scott asked, his hand resting lightly on his utility belt. Alicia turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "That's what I was about to ask. This car's been sitting outside my father's house all night, and no one seems to care." Scott's gaze flickered between Alicia and Walter. "And you are?" "Alicia Parker," she said, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Attorney, advocate, and his daughter." Scott's demeanor shifted, the name clearly ringing a bell. He cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. "I see." "Do you?" Alicia asked, taking a step closer. "Because I have a hard time believing that someone reported this hours ago, and you've only just now decided to show up." "We're doing the best we can," Scott replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've had a lot on our plate tonight." Walter stepped forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. "It's always the same excuse," he said quietly. "But it's funny how quickly you showed up when my daughter got involved." Scott shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Parker, we don't prioritize based—" "Don't," Alicia interrupted, her tone icy. "Don't lie to me. I've been doing this long enough to know how the system works. The fact that my father's word wasn't enough for you is a problem." Scott opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another officer approached from the cruiser. "Adam," she said quietly, her gaze darting to Alicia. "We've got a hit on the plates." Scott turned to her, his expression tightening. "And?" "It's flagged," she replied. "Stolen vehicle." The tension in the air thickened. Alicia turned back to the driver, who now looked visibly nervous. "Step out of the car," she commanded, her voice low but firm. The driver hesitated, but the second officer moved forward, her hand resting on her holstered taser. "You heard her. Step out." Grudgingly, the man opened the door and climbed out, his hands raised slightly. As the second officer began to pat him down, Alicia turned to Scott. "This could have ended badly," she said, her voice cold. "If you just listened to my father, you might have stopped this hours ago." Scott didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground. Walter watched him, his expression unreadable. "Officer Scott," Walter said after a long pause, "let me ask you something. If it hadn't been my daughter standing here tonight, would you have even bothered to show up?" Scott looked up, his face a mixture of defensiveness and shame. I don't know." Walter nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet disappointment. "At least you're honest about that." The second officer returned, holding a small bag of what looked like stolen credit cards. "He's got a lot to answer for," she said grimly. "We'll take it from here." Alicia stepped back, letting the officers handle the situation. She turned to Walter, her expression softening. "Let's go inside, Dad. It's been a long night." Walter hesitated, his gaze lingering on Scott for a moment longer. "You've got a lot to learn, son," he said quietly. "But it's not too late." With that, he turned and followed Alicia toward the house. The sound of the cruiser's engine starting filled the air as it pulled away, taking the driver into custody. As Alicia unlocked the front door, she glanced at her father. "Are you okay?" Walter smiled faintly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just proud of you." She looked at him, surprised. "Proud? For what?" "For fighting the fights I never could," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion, "even when it's not easy." They stepped inside, the weight of the night slowly lifting. But in the quiet of the house, Alicia couldn't shake the thought that there was still so much work to be done. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Walter sat in his favorite armchair, his cane resting against the side, while Alicia busied herself in the kitchen making tea. Despite the warmth of the home, the tension from the evening lingered like an uninvited guest. Alicia carried 2 mugs to the living room, setting one on the small table beside her father. "Here," she said softly, sitting across from him on the couch. "You need something warm after all of that." Walter nodded his thanks, but didn't immediately reach for the tea. Instead, he stared at his hands, the lines and creases evidence of a lifetime of hard work and quiet endurance. After a long moment, he looked up at his daughter. "You were amazing tonight," he said, his voice carrying both pride and sadness. Alicia took a sip of her tea, her gaze steady. "I just did what needed to be done, Dad. You shouldn't have had to deal with that in the first place." Walter let out a heavy sigh. "Maybe. But what you did, you stood up for me in a way I've never been able to stand up for myself. You made them listen." Alicia's jaw tightened. "I shouldn't have to. People like that, officer, should know better. It's 2025, not 1955. Walter gave a small, weary smile. "The calendar might have changed, sweetheart, but people, they're slower to catch up. Doesn't mean we stop trying, though." Alicia leaned forward, setting her mug down. "But you shouldn't have to try, Dad. You've done enough. You've lived a good, honest life. You've given so much to this community, and for what? To be treated like a suspect in your own neighborhood?" Walter raised a hand, gently cutting her off. "Alicia, it's not about what I deserve. It's about what we do every day to make the world a little better. You fight in the courts, and I fought in the classroom. But the fight's never over." Alicia looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You shouldn't have to fight anymore. You've done your part." Walter's gaze softened. "Maybe. But there's one fight I still regret walking away from." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression growing distant. "You, Alicia. I should have fought harder for us, for our family. When your mother and I drifted apart, I let my pride get in the way. And when you decided to focus on your career, I let that distance grow even wider." Alicia shook her head, her voice trembling. "Dad, no, that wasn't your fault. I was the one who pulled away. I was so focused on making a difference, on proving myself, that I didn't think about what it cost." Walter's lips quirked into a sad smile. "And I let you go without a fight. Tonight reminded me of that, seeing you stand up for me, seeing how strong you are. I realized how much I've missed. And I don't want to miss any more." Alicia wiped at her eyes, her composure breaking. "I don't want to miss any more, either." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of their shared regrets hanging between them. Then, tentatively, Alicia reached out, and Walter clasped her hand in his, the years of distance dissolving in the warmth of their touch. The next morning, Walter sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window. Alicia stood at the counter, flipping through her phone. She glanced up when Walter cleared his throat. "What's on your mind?" Walter hesitated before speaking. "Do you think Officer Scott learned anything last?" Alicia frowned. "Honestly, I don't know. People like him, sometimes they don't change. Sometimes they doubled down on their biases. Walter nodded slowly. Maybe. But I saw something in him last night. He looked shaken, like he realized something about himself he wasn't ready to face. Alicia walked over, setting her phone down on the table. Do you want to believe he can change? Walter met her gaze. I want to believe anyone can change. It's what I taught all those years in the classroom. People have to be given the chance to grow. Before Alicia could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Walter's brow furrowed. Who could that be? Alicia walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. Her expression shifted to one of surprise as she opened it. Standing on the porch was Officer Scott, his hat in his hand. Officer Scott, Alicia said, her tone cautious. What brings you here? Scott shifted awkwardly, his eyes darting between Alicia and Walter, who had joined her at the door. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice stiff but earnest, for how I handled things last night. Walter studied him for a moment before nodding. Go on. Scott cleared his throat, his grip tightening on his hat. I've been a cop for 7 years, and I've prided myself on doing things by the book. But last night, I realized that sometimes the book isn't enough. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and for that I'm sorry. Alicia crossed her arms, skeptical. And what are you going to do about it? Scott looked at her, then at Walter. I'm going to be better. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm going to figure it out. And if it's okay with you, Mr. Parker, I'd like to start by listening. Walter's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. Listening is a good place to start. Alicia looked at her father, surprised. You're really willing to let him off that easy? Walter turned to her, his expression calm but firm. It's not about letting him off, Alicia. It's about giving him a chance. If I don't believe in second chances, what kind of teacher would I be? Scott looked at Walter, his gratitude evident. Thank you, sir. I promise I won't waste it. Walter nodded. We'll hold you to that. As Scott left, Alicia turned to her father, a mix of frustration and admiration in her eyes. You're a better person than I am, Dad? Walter chuckled softly. No, I'm just an old man who's seen enough to know that anger alone won't fix anything. Change takes patience, and sometimes it starts with small steps. Alicia smiled despite herself, wrapping her arm around her father's shoulders. Well, you're a better teacher than most, and maybe you're right. Small steps can lead to big changes. Walter patted her hand, his eyes twinkling. That's my girl. As the morning sunlight bathed the room, father and daughter sat together, sharing a quiet moment of connection. Outside, the world carried on, but inside, a new chapter had begun, one of healing, growth, and hope for a better tomorrow.